I'm scheduled to deploy again for a few months, the end of 2012, because I'm part of this family of the military. Other men and women talk to me who are in the military. About 7-8 years ago, I was doing a briefing with a bunch of Marines that were deploying overseas. Beginning part of the briefing, I walked in. Nobody would talk to me because I walk in as a lieutenant colonel. They didn't want to talk to me. But it wasn't just that. They didn't know if I had experience where they were going. Once I did my briefing and that I talked about the fact that I had been overseas, that I had been to Saudi Arabia, after the briefing, many of the Marines came up to talk to me because they could relate. I had been there. Not where they were going, but deployed. Jesus needed to identify with us. And the only way to do that was to become human, to become one like us. The author of Hebrews in Hebrews chapter 4, 2 chapters later says, "For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who was tempted in every way." Wednesday night at the sermon study group. If any of you are interested to look at or to talk about what we're going to talk about the next Sunday, we meet at 7 o'clock here at church. There were about 6 or 8 of us got together this past Wednesday night. We spent a lot of time talking about just this little part of this verse. One who has been tempted in every way, just as we. Jesus needed to be seeing life through human eyes, feeling life through our hands, and being tempted in every single way that we are to truly understand who we are, even though He created us. So the first idea here is the fact that Christ needs to identify with us. And it's interesting because, I don't know, 30, 40, 50 years after Christ's resurrection and ascension, there were some different heresies that came up. One was the heresy called, I'm going to probably say this wrong, but Docetism. Docetism were individuals who taught that Jesus was a spirit, God's spirit, but when He would walk across the grass, not a blade of grass would be moved. He could walk across the sand and there'd be no sand print, no footprint. So our poem, the poem Footprints in the Sand wouldn't be valid because there would be no footprints from Jesus because He wasn't human. There were other heresies that said He was completely human, and it wasn't until His baptism that a godness came upon Him. The spirit of the dove came upon Him when John the Baptist baptized Him. Neither one of those are what Scripture says. Scripture says that He was born of the Virgin. We're going to look at that to identify with us. Not giving up His godliness, but taking on a humanness. Again, why? To identify with us. The second idea I just want to bring up this morning is simply that Jesus also dignified humanity. Jesus dignified us. We live in a culture which today is really in some respects putting humanity down. What do I mean by that? If there are no higher morals or standards that we follow, what does that leave us to be? Animals. Leaves us to be animals. It puts us at a lower position. It makes us to be that we cannot control our urges, that we cannot control what we do. If we just have an animalistic nature in who we are, then we go into the survival of the fittest. We go into the do whatever is going to be best for me. We get into the idea if there's no standards or morals, we can follow what society says, but really it's what's important for me. How do I get ahead? it's interesting because when you, I don't know if you do, I know when I hear the word humanism, I tend to think of non-Christian trying to build people up. Some people call it secular humanism. And for myself, as a pastor, as a Christian, I see that as a negative, because the reality is, if we don't have a moral or a standard, and if all we are is just a little higher, or even not higher than animals, all we are is animals, and we have that animal basic instincts. The reality, humanism started in the 1600s, some of you probably know the dates better than me, 1600s, by Christian leaders who said, as a Christian, God sent His Son to identify with us, but also to dignify us. To dignify us. To lift us up. That we are so much more than the animals. We have been given a life within our lives. It's interesting. It's the psalmist says to us, Psalm 8, "What is man that you are mindful of him? God, what are we that you are mindful of us? And the Son of Man that you care for him." The psalmist goes from what is man, all of us, men and women, to the Son of Man, Jesus Christ, that you are mindful of him. The next part of this verse, I think it fits to both humanity but also to Jesus Christ. "You made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor." So Jesus Christ, we know that from the book of Philippians, when it talks about Christ, who did not consider equality with God something to hold on to, but He gave up His divinity in some respects to become human, to dignify us, and God gave Him glory and honor. But God also within this process, through Jesus Christ, as Christ identifies with us, Christ gives us a dignity. He gives us a dignity which is beyond anything else that we could get from society. I mean, just sit back and let that sink in for a second. The God of the universe sent His Son to be like us, to become one of us. What if God was one of us? God is one of us. Isaiah, the Old Testament prophet, has this to say. Oops, I jumped my slide. Just go back one, Kim. Thanks. If we look in the book of Genesis also with the creation story, thinking about how God dignifies us. If you look in the creation story, when God created things, He said, "Let there be," and there was. Let there be, and there was. And God created, and there was. But with Adam and Eve, what does God say? Let us make man in our image. There's a huge difference there. Huge difference. Not just simply let there be, but let us make God in our image. So, thousands of years later, when Christ comes on the scene, He identifies with us and He takes us back to the creation story when God says, "Let us make man, let us make woman in our image." Our, the Trinity, our image. He dignifies who we are. So first, Christ identifies with us. Second, He dignifies who we are. And third, I got a good 3-point sermon today, 3-point teaching. I usually don't have just 3 points. Third one, Christ delivers us. He delivered us. Isaiah, the Old Testament prophet, said, many hundreds of years before Jesus Christ was born, "Therefore the Lord Himself will give you a sign. The virgin will be with child, and she will give birth to a son, and you will call him Emmanuel." Emmanuel, God with us. God incarnate with us. Author of Hebrews also talks about, as we already looked at, that God has given His Son, as He brought Him a little lower